When my found husband, fighting for his life in the ICU, while our son and his wife calmly planned how to spend his estate, my heart broke but my training kicked in. I'm Darlene, 56, a retired escrow officer from Oregon. They wanted a tragedy. They forgot I trace paper trails for a living. The Pacific Northwest rain was relentless that Tuesday, drumming a steady, heavy beat against the windshield of my old Subaru as I drove back into Coos Bay. I had gone up to Seattle to help my aging aunt settle into an assisted living facility, a trip that was supposed to take a full week. But on the third night, a strange cold dread had settled deep in my chest. It was the kind of instinct you learn to trust when you've spent 30 years reading the fine print on real estate deeds, looking for the tiny discrepancies that others miss. I called my husband, Arthur, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I called our son, Bradley, and got a hurried, dismissive text, "Dad's busy in the workshop. Talk later." That text didn't sit right. Arthur never left his phone off when I was away, not in 34 years of marriage. He was a retired boat builder, a man whose hands were permanently stained with teak oil and whose heart was as steady as the tides. By 5 in the morning, I was on the interstate, driving south through the gray, fog-shrouded pines. My fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly they turned white. Clinging to my keys, my thumb repeatedly grazed the heavy brass tide clock keychain Arthur had cast for me in his workshop on our 10th anniversary. It was a simple, solid weight. A reminder of home. When I finally crossed the bridge into Coos Bay, my phone lit up with a call from the regional hospital. The drive to the emergency room was a blur of wipers scraping against the glass and the taste of stale thermos coffee. By the time I parked and ran through the sliding glass doors, the sterile, bleached smell of the hospital hit me like a wall. I managed to flag down a nurse, my voice trembling as I gave Arthur's name. "ICU, 3rd floor," she said, her eyes softening with that quiet pity reserved for people whose lives are about to collapse. "He's in room 312. The doctor is in there now." My knees felt weak as the elevator climbed. I am not a fragile woman. I have worked hard my entire life, starting as a local title clerk earning minimum wage, slowly climbing the ranks to escrow officer by studying at night while Bradley was asleep in his crib. I have closed thousands of deals, dealt with angry buyers, shady developers, and desperate sellers. I know how to keep my composure. But as the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, my breath caught in my throat. There, sitting in the waiting area just outside the double doors of the intensive care unit, were Bradley and his wife, Chelsea. They didn't see me at first. They were huddled together in the vinyl chairs, the light from Chelsea's phone illuminating her face. On the floor beside her sat an expensive, cream-colored designer handbagger, stark contrast to the worn canvas tote I carried. Bradley was holding a paper cup from the gourmet coffee shop down the street, casually swirling the liquid inside. I stopped in my tracks, shadowed by a large potted ficus, my wet yellow raincoat dripping onto the linoleum. I wanted to call out to them, to throw my arms around my son and weep. But then, Bradley's voice carried over the hum of the vending machines. "If the worst happens, we need to make sure we have the power of attorney paperwork ready for the bank," Bradley whispered, his tone flat, devoid of any urgency. "The operating account for the boatyard has at least $200,000 in liquid cash right now. If Mom gets her hands on it, she just frees everything to pay the hospital bills." Chelsea patted his knee, her manicured nails catching the harsh fluorescent light. "And what about the coastal lot? The one overlooking the bay? We need to make sure that deed isn't tied up in probate. If we can get him to sign the transfer document before they take him off the ventilator, we can list it by spring. I already talked to a developer in Eugene. They're offering top dollar. We'll have to find where he keeps the spare notary stamp," Bradley muttered, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Mom probably has it in her desk. She's so old school, she keeps all those records in her leather-bound planner." I stood there, the damp cold of the Oregon rain seeping through my clothes, but my blood ran hot. It felt as though the floor had tilted beneath my feet. If you have ever stood in a room and realized that the child you carried, the boy whose scraped knees you bandaged and whose college tuition you paid by sacrificing every luxury, views your dying husband as nothing more than a financial hurdle, then you know the precise, agonizing ache that opened up in my chest. Some of you reading this might think I should have screamed. You might think I should have rushed forward, slapped the coffee out of his hand, and demanded to know how he could be so cruel. But when you spend decades in escrow, you learn that anger makes you sloppy. You learn that the person who panics first loses the asset. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold air clear the fog in my mind. I adjusted the strap of my canvas bag, stepped out from behind the plant, and walked toward them. "Bradley," I said, my voice quiet, even, and entirely devoid of the trembling that had consumed me moments before. They both jumped. Chelsea instantly dropped her phone onto her lap, her face flushing a guilty, blotchy red. Bradley spilled a few drops of his latte onto his pristine designer sneakers. "Mom," Bradley stammered, standing up quickly, his face twisting into a theatrical mask of grief. You're early. We didn't expect you until tomorrow." "Oh Mom, it's terrible. Dad had a massive stroke. They found him in the workshop." "Who found him, Bradley?" I asked, walking right past him, toward the heavy ICU doors. "I did," Bradley said quickly, following close behind me. "I went to check on him this morning and he was on the floor. I called 911 right away." I stopped at the threshold of Arthur's room. Through the glass, I saw him. My strong, beautiful husband, who had spent his life building fishing boats with his own hands, looked so incredibly small beneath the white hospital sheets. A thick plastic tube was taped to his mouth, a machine forcing air into his lungs with a rhythmic, agonizing asterisk, whoosh, dash click, whoosh click, asterisk. His face was pale, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling only at the command of the computer beside him. The doctor, a tired-looking man in blue scrubs, stepped out of the room and looked at me. "Are you Darlene?" "I am," I said, my hand reaching out to touch the cold glass. "How is he, doctor?" "He suffered a severe ischemic stroke," the doctor explained gently, pulling me a few steps away from Bradley and Chelsea. "The damage is extensive. What's deeply concerning is the timeline. The stroke occurred at least 12 to 14 hours before he arrived at the emergency room. If he had been brought in sooner, we could have administered clot-busting medication, but by the time the ambulance was called this morning, the damage was already done. We are doing everything we can, but the next 48 hours are critical." 12 to 14 hours. I turned my head slowly to look at my son. Bradley was looking down at his shoes, avoiding my gaze. Chelsea was busy adjusting her designer bag on her shoulder, looking bored by the medical jargon. The math was simple, and it was devastating. Arthur had fallen yesterday evening. Bradley had told me he was busy in the workshop last night. He had known. Or worse, he had found his father, saw an opportunity, and delayed calling for help to ensure the damage would be irreversible, giving them time to search our home for financial documents, deeds, and my notary seals. A wave of nausea washed over me, so intense I had to grip the handrail on the wall to keep from falling. I felt the crushing weight of my own vulnerability. I wanted to curl up beside Arthur on that narrow hospital bed and cry until my throat was raw. I wanted to ask God why my own flesh and blood could be so utterly devoid of humanity. But as I looked at Arthur's pale face, I knew I couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. Arthur had spent his life protecting this family, and now, it was my turn to protect him from the vultures we had raised. "Thank you, doctor," I said softly. "Please do whatever it takes. Spare no expense." "Of course," the doctor nodded, "but we will need to discuss the billing and insurance details with the administrative office soon. The ICU costs are already accumulating." "I'll handle it immediately," I replied. I turned back to Bradley and Chelsea. They were watching me, their eyes gleaming with a predatory curiosity. They wanted to see if I was going to break. They wanted to see if I would hand over the keys to the kingdom in my grief. "Mom," Bradley said, taking a step toward me, putting a heavy, false arm around my shoulder. "You must be exhausted. Why don't you go home and get some rest? Chelsea and I can stay here. We can handle the hospital paperwork. You know how complicated these medical bills can get. Just give us your signature on the authorization forms, and we'll take care of everything." I looked at his hand on my shoulder. The hand of my son. The hand that had held a pen, likely signing drafts of unauthorized documents while his father lay dying on a cold concrete floor. "No, Bradley," I said, my voice as cold and steady as the coastal winter. "I'm not going anywhere." I reached into my canvas bag, pulled out my phone, and walked toward the quiet alcove at the end of the hallway, leaving them standing there in their expensive clothes, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was already beginning to crumble. I stood in that narrow hospital alcove, the cold glass of the window pane pressing against my forehead as I looked out at the gray, rain-swept harbor of Coos Bay. The harbor was filled with fishing boats, their masts swaying like skeletal fingers in the storm. For 34 years, Arthur had worked on those boats, his hands rough and calloused, smelling of cedar shavings and fiberglass resin. He was a man who believed in a hard day's work and a quiet night's rest. And now, he was hooked up to a machine that sounded like a bellows, breathing for him because our own son had decided that a few $100,000 was worth more than his father's life. If you have ever had to look at your own child, the baby you rocked to sleep when his fever wouldn't break, the boy whose college tuition you paid by driving a rusted-out car for 10 years and realize he is a stranger who would gladly watch you drown for a piece of dry land. Then you know the cold, hollow ache that settled into my bones right then. I didn't cry. My tear ducts felt as dry as old parchment. When you spend 30 years in escrow, you learn that tears don't stop a foreclosure. And they certainly don't stop a thief. Only paper does. I pulled my phone from my canvas bag. My fingers were cold, but they didn't shake. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It wasn't the police, not yet. I didn't have proof of the delay, only the doctor's estimate, and a mother's devastating intuition. No, I dialed Sarah, the branch operations manager at the Coos Bay Community Credit Union. Sarah and I had worked together on hundreds of real estate closings over the decades. She knew my voice, she knew my family, and most importantly, she knew the exact anatomy of our finances. Darlene, Sarah's voice came through the line, warm and familiar, a sharp contrast to the sterile hum of the ICU. I thought you were up in Seattle. Is everything okay? Arthur had a stroke. Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though it carried the weight of a heavy iron anchor. He's in the ICU, it's bad. I heard her gasp, the rustle of papers on her desk instantly stopping. Oh, Darlene. I am so sorry. What can I do? Do you need me to come down there? I need your eyes on our accounts, Sarah, I said, leaning my shoulder against the wall, my eyes tracking Bradley and Chelsea through the glass doors of the waiting room. They were still huddled together, Chelsea pointing at her phone screen, probably showing Bradley some luxury rental in Eugene they thought they could afford now. I need to know if there has been any unusual activity in the last 24 hours. Specifically on the boatyard's operating account and our personal home equity line. Hold on, Sarah said, her tone instantly shifting from grieving friend to sharp professional. I heard the rapid click of her keyboard, a sound that had comforted me for 30 years. Okay, I'm looking at the boatyard commercial account. Darlene. There was a wire transfer request initiated online last night at 10:15 p.m. for $85,000. It's pending approval because it exceeded the daily limit for unverified external transfers. My stomach dropped, a sickening, heavy thud. 10:15 last night. Arthur was already on the floor of his workshop, unable to move, unable to speak, while our son was sitting at a computer, trying to drain his father's life savings. Who initiated it? Sarah, I asked, though I already knew the answer. The login credentials used were Arthur's, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a tense whisper. But the destination account is registered to an LLC called BC Development. Bradley's initials. Darlene, what is going on? Bradley has a limited debit card for purchasing marine supplies, but he must have found Arthur's master password list in the desk. I explained, my eyes narrowing as I watched my son laugh quietly at something Chelsea said. They were celebrating. They thought they had one. Sarah, as the primary joint owner on all corporate and personal accounts, I want you to freeze everything. Right now. Lock the commercial operating account, the personal savings, the home equity line, and the trust accounts. Remove all online access immediately. I can do that under the emergency protocol for suspected elder financial abuse, Sarah said, her voice firm. But Bradley is going to get a notification the second he tries to use his card or check the balance. He's going to panic. Let him panic, I said, my voice as cold as the Oregon rain. And Sarah, there's a dark green accordion folder in the safe deposit box at your branch. The one with the frayed black ribbon. It contains the original deed to the coastal lot and the revocable living trust documents. I need you to pull that box and have it ready for me. I'm coming down there now. I'll have it on my desk before you get here. Darlene, be careful. I hung up the phone and took a long, deep breath. I stood there in the quiet alcove for a moment, letting the mask of the grieving, helpless mother slip back over my face. If you want to catch a predator, you don't stand in the open with a spear. You lay the trap and wait for them to step into it. I walked back into the waiting room. Chelsea was applying a fresh layer of pink lip gloss, using her phone screen as a mirror. Bradley looked up, his face instantly shifting back into that pathetic, practiced expression of concern. Mom, he said, standing up. Did you talk to the billing office? Because Chelsea and I were thinking, if we can just get your signature on that power of attorney form, we can handle the hospital administration for you. We don't want you worrying about money right now. That's very sweet of you, Bradley, I said, keeping my voice soft, letting a little tremble creep into my lower lip. I even reached out and patted his arm, feeling the expensive fabric of his jacket. But my purse is at home, and my head is spinning. I need to drive back to the house, get a fresh change of clothes for Arthur, and find his insurance card. I must have left it in my desk. Chelsea's eyes lit up. Do you want us to come with you, Mom? We can help you search the office. You know how cluttered Dad's workshop gets. No, I said, offering a weak, exhausted smile. You stay here, in case the doctor has any updates. I'll be back in an hour. Are you sure you're okay to drive, Mom? Bradley asked, though his eyes were darting toward my canvas bag, probably wondering if the notary stamp was inside it. I'll be fine, sweetie, I murmured. As I walked out of the hospital and into the pouring rain, the damp cold hit me, but I welcomed it. It kept me sharp. I got into my old Subaru, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. I drove through the quiet streets of Coos Bay, past the docks where Arthur's boats were moored, their hulls painted in deep blues and forest greens. When I pulled into our driveway, the sight of our home broke my heart all over again. It was a modest, gray-shingled ranch house, surrounded by wild rhododendrons and towering pine trees. Arthur had built the porch himself out of reclaimed cedar. I walked up the steps, my boots squeaking on the wet wood, and unlocked the front door. The moment I stepped inside, the silence of the house pressed against my ears. But something was wrong. The air felt disturbed. I walked into the kitchen. On the counter, Arthur's coffee mug from yesterday morning was still sitting there, a thin ring of dark liquid dried at the bottom. But the cabinet doors above the counter were slightly ajar. I walked down the hallway to our small home office, where I kept my escrow files and where Arthur kept his boatyard ledgers. The room had been ransacked. It wasn't a violent robbery, but a calculated, hurried search. The drawers of my oak desk were pulled out, papers scattered across the desktop. My leather-bound notary planner had been moved, its pages ruffled. They had been looking for my active notary stamp and the spare keys to the safe deposit box. They had even looked under the mattress in the spare bedroom, the quilt pulled back and left in a heap on the floor. My own son had searched my home like a thief while his father lay dying. I stood in the center of the messy office, my hands clenched into fists. A wave of profound vulnerability washed over me. This was the home where we had raised him. This was the desk where I had sat night after night, studying for my escrow license while Bradley slept down the hall, dreaming of a future I was working myself to the bone to secure for him. But then, I looked at the corner of the room, near Arthur's drafting table. Sitting there was an old, heavy cedar toolbox. It was weathered, its brass corners tarnished with age, built by Arthur during his very first year as an apprentice. To anyone else, it looked like a piece of junk filled with old rusty hinges and forgotten screws. But Bradley didn't know about the false bottom. He had never cared enough about his father's craft to learn how the box was built. I knelt on the floor, the smell of sawdust and old iron filling my nose. I opened the heavy lid, removed the top tray of rusted bolts, and pressed my thumb against the small knot in the cedar wood on the left side. With a soft click, the false bottom popped up. Inside lay my active notary public seal, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel. Beside it was the spare key to the safe deposit box, and a small, handwritten journal where Arthur kept a log of every boat he had ever built, along with the names of the families who bought them. I took the notary stamp and the key, placing them carefully into my canvas bag. I didn't clean up the mess Bradley had made. I wanted it to stay exactly as it was, a physical testament to his betrayal. I stood up, walked back out to my car, and drove straight to the credit union. The storm was getting worse, the wind whipping the waves of the bay into whitecaps, but as I walked through the double doors of the bank, my mind was entirely clear. The paper trail was waiting, and I was ready to follow it to the very end. The heavy glass doors closed behind me, shutting out the howling wind, but the storm inside me was only beginning. The double doors of the Coos Bay Community Credit Union let out a soft, pressurized hiss as I pushed them open, stepping from the freezing rain into the quiet, carpeted warmth of the lobby. The smell of damp wool and floor wax hung heavy in the air. It was a familiar smell, one that usually brought me a sense of peace. For 30 years, I had walked through these doors to deposit checks, clear escrows, and chat with the tellers who had watched my son grow from a toddler into a man. But today, The familiar warmth felt like a mockery. Sarah was waiting for me near the heavy iron gate that led to the safe deposit vault. She looked up from her desk, her eyes tight with a mixture of professional focus and deep, personal worry. She didn't say a word at first. She just stood up, walked over to me, and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. I let myself lean into her for just a second, feeling the dampness of my own coat press against her neat blazer. "I've got the box ready in the private viewing room, Darlene," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "And I ran the audit trail on the Boatyard account. It's worse than we thought. There were 3 failed login attempts from a mobile device yesterday afternoon, starting around 4 o'clock. Whoever was trying to get in didn't have the secondary verification code, so they kept trying until they locked the online portal. Then, at 10:15, they bypassed it using Arthur's recovery email. 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The doctor had said Arthur's stroke happened 12 to 14 hours before he was brought to the ER. That meant while my husband was lying paralyzed on the sawdust-covered floor of his beloved workshop, his chest struggling for air, our son was standing over him, or perhaps sitting in his truck just outside, trying to hack into our bank accounts. He hadn't called 911 because he needed the online portal unlocked first. He needed the money moved before the world found out his father was incapacitated. I felt a cold, hard stone settle in the pit of my stomach. The vulnerability was there, aching and raw, but beneath it, a lifetime of professional discipline took over. "Show me the documents, Sarah." She led me into the small, windowless viewing room. On the polished wood table sat the long, gray metal safe deposit box. Next to it was the dark green accordion folder with the frayed black ribbon, the repository of our family's entire life. I sat down, my knees clicking in the quiet room. I pulled the key I had retrieved from Arthur's secret cedar box out of my canvas bag and slid it into Sarah's hand. She inserted it alongside the bank's master key, turned it with a heavy, metallic asterisk, clack asterisk, and slid the lid open. I didn't reach for the deeds first. I reached for the thick, bound document titled asterisk, the Arthur and Darlene Vance Revocable Living Trust asterisk. I know some of you sitting at your own kitchen tables right now might think that a trust is only for the wealthy, for people with mansions and yachts. But let me tell you something, when you work in escrow, you see how quickly a family can be torn apart by probate court. Arthur and I had set up this trust 20 years ago to protect our modest assets, our home, the boatyard, and the 3-acre coastal lot overlooking the bay from the very greed that was now staring us in the face. I flipped through the pages, my fingers moving with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent her life reading the fine print. I found the section on trustee powers. Asterisk, in the event of the physical or mental incapacity of either co-trustee, certified in writing by a licensed physician, the remaining co-trustee shall assume sole and exclusive management of all trust assets, including all corporate, real estate, and financial holdings, without the requirement of joint signatures. Asterisk. I looked up at Sarah. I need a standard revocation of power of attorney. Right now. I already drafted it, Sarah said, pulling a crisp, white document from her desk folder. This will legally strip Bradley of the secondary signing authority he has on the boatyard's commercial accounts. But Darlene, to make this absolute, you'll need that physician's certificate from the ICU doctor. Without it, Bradley's lawyers could argue that Arthur is still a competent co-trustee, and that Bradley was acting on his verbal authorization. "I'll get the certificate," I said, my voice steady. "The doctor knows the timeline now. He knows Arthur was left on that floor for hours." I took my active notary public seal from my bag, the heavy, black metal stamp that Bradley had searched our entire house to find. I held it in my hand, feeling its familiar weight. It was a tool of truth. For 30 years, this stamp had verified the identities of honest people buying their first homes. Now, it was going to protect my husband from his own blood. "Sarah," I said, signing my name on the revocation document with a steady hand. "I need you to notarize my signature on this. And then, I want you to draft a formal notification of account closure for every single card and line of credit associated with Bradley's name. If he tries to buy a pack of gum on our dime, I want the system to flag it as unauthorized." "It's done," Sarah said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "But Darlene, the second this goes through, Bradley's phone is going to light up with notifications. He's going to know you've shut him out." "That is exactly what I want," I murmured, watching the laser printer in the corner spit out the documents with a rhythmic, mechanical hiss. "I want him to feel the walls closing in. But I want him to think it's a system error. I want him to believe he still has a chance to fix it. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes catching a framed photograph of Bradley on Sarah's desk. It was from his high school graduation, 15 years ago. He had been smiling, his arm draped over Arthur's shoulder, both of them covered in a light dusting of cedar shavings from the boatyard. Where had that boy gone? How had we raised a man who could calculate the value of his father's death while his father's body was still warm? If you have ever had to ask yourself where you went wrong as a parent, you know the quiet, suffocating guilt that comes with it. I wondered if we had made things too easy for him. I wondered if my own long hours at the escrow office, trying to build a stable life for us, had taught him that money was the only language that mattered. But as I looked at the dark green folder, I knew that guilt was a luxury I couldn't afford today. Arthur was in that ICU bed, fighting for every breath. I had to be his shield. Suddenly, the quiet of the viewing room was shattered by the sharp, persistent buzz of my phone. I pulled it from my bag. The caller ID read *Bradley*. I looked at Sarah. She froze, her hand hovering over the notary stamp. "Play along," I whispered to her. I slid my thumb across the screen and put the phone to my ear, letting my shoulders slump, forcing my voice to drop into a fragile, trembling register. "Bradley," I gasped, sounding like a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "Oh, Bradley. Thank goodness you called. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm at the bank trying to figure out the insurance deposits, and everything is so confusing. Mom." Bradley's voice came through the line, loud and sharp, his usual mask of calm completely gone. I could hear the background noise of a busy street. He wasn't at the hospital. He was out. "Mom, what is going on with the accounts?" "I just tried to use the corporate card to pay for some medical supplies and Ed's to get some lunch, and the transaction was declined. It said, account restricted. Did you change something?" I don't know, sweetie," I whimpered, biting my lip to keep from laughing at the sheer predictability of his greed. "The girl at the counter here said there's some kind of security hold because of Arthur's ICU admission. She said the fraud department flagged some large online transfer attempts from last night." "Oh, Bradley, did someone try to rob us while your father was sick?" There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing. A security hold," Bradley stammered, his voice tight with panic. "No, Mom, that's crazy. It must be a mistake. Look, don't talk to the bank people. They don't know what they're doing. They'll just freeze everything and we won't be able to pay for Dad's treatment. Where are you right now? I can come down there and help you sort it out." "Oh, thank you, sweetie, but I'm just leaving," I said, signing the revocation form Sarah had placed in front of me. My pen strokes firm and decisive despite the fragile tone of my voice. "The nice lady here said the main manager has to review it, and it might take a few hours to clear up. I'm going to head back to the hospital now. Have you been with your father?" Yeah, Chelsea is there now." Bradley lied, his voice hurried. "Listen, Mom, if they ask you to sign anything, don't do it until I look at it, okay? Especially anything about the trust or the property. We need to keep things simple." "Of course, Bradley," I whispered, my eyes locking onto the original deed to the coastal lot sitting on the table. "I always trust you to do what's best for the family." "Okay, I'll meet you at the ICU in 20 minutes, he said, and hung up. I lowered the phone. The silence returned to the small viewing room, heavy and absolute. I looked at Sarah, who was already sealing the notarized revocation document in a secure envelope. "He's running," I said, my voice returning to its normal, cool register. "He knows the window is closing. He's going to try to get me to sign a power of attorney the second I get back to that hospital." "Let him try," Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a rare, quiet anger. "We've locked the vault, Darlene. The money is safe. The deed is safe. But you need to get that doctor's signature before he realizes he's been completely cut off." I stood up, sliding the dark green accordion folder into my canvas bag, right next to my notary stamp. The weight of the bag felt different now. It didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like armor. I walked out of the bank and back into the relentless Oregon rain, the cold water splashing against my boots. As I drove my old Subaru back toward the hospital, the wipers scraping a steady, defiant rhythm against the windshield, I knew the hardest part was still ahead of me. I had to sit in that hospital room, look my own son in the eye, and pretend to be the helpless, grieving mother he thought I was, all while holding the very documents that would bring his entire world crashing down around him. The gray hospital tower loomed ahead through the fog, its sterile lights shining like cold stars in the afternoon gloom. The elevator ride back up to the third floor of the hospital was the longest 90 seconds of my life. I stood in the corner of the metal box, my wet yellow raincoat dripping a small puddle onto the gray rubber floor. In my hand, I gripped the strap of my canvas tote bag so tightly my knuckles ached. Inside that bag was 30 years of my life, summarized in neat, legal paragraphs, sealed with the heavy black ink of my notary stamp. If you have ever had to walk back into a room knowing the people waiting for you are praying for your downfall, then you know the cold, heavy weight that settles in your stomach. It makes every step feel like you're walking through wet cement. You find yourself asking, how did I get here? Where did the little boy go who used to hold my hand when we crossed the street? But as the elevator doors slid open with a soft, clinical chime, I forced those thoughts out of my mind. Grief is a passenger, but right now, survival was behind the wheel. I didn't go straight to the waiting room. Instead, I walked down the opposite corridor toward the glass-walled nurses' station. Dr. Sterling was there, rubbing his eyes as he reviewed a chart on a computer screen. He looked up as my boots squeaked on the linoleum. "Darlene," he said, his voice quiet and respectful. "I was just about to have the nurse call you. We've stabilized Arthur's blood pressure, but he's still entirely dependent on the ventilator. The next 24 hours will tell us if there's any neurological recovery." "Thank you, doctor," I said, leaning against the high counter of the station. I pulled the crisp, white document Sarah had printed for me out of my bag. "I need you to look at this. It's a certificate of incapacity. Under the terms of the Vance Revocable Living Trust, if Arthur is physically or mentally unable to manage our affairs, a licensed physician must certify his condition in writing so that I can assume sole trustee powers." Dr. Sterling took the paper, his eyes scanning the precise, legal language. He was a medical man, but in a small town like Coos he knew how the world worked. He knew that without this paper, a family's life savings could be tied up in probate court for months while the bills piled up. "I can sign this, Darlene," he said, reaching for a blue ballpoint pen in his breast pocket. "Arthur is legally incapacitated. There is no question about that. But are you sure you're ready for the administrative burden of this right now?" "I've spent 30 years reading the fine print, doctor," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I am more than ready." He placed the document on the counter, signed his name with a quick, decisive stroke, and pressed his medical license stamp into the paper. "There you go. I'll have the nurse place a copy in his medical file as well." "Thank you," I whispered, folding the paper carefully and sliding it back into my canvas bag. Now, the shield was complete. Now, I had the law on my side. I walked back down the hallway toward the ICU waiting room. As I neared the double doors, I saw them. Bradley and Chelsea were standing near the window, their heads close together. Chelsea was holding a blue plastic clipboard she must have taken from the administrative desk. And Bradley was pointing at a specific line on a piece of paper, his face tight with frustration. "If she doesn't sign it today, we're screwed," Bradley was saying, his voice carrying down the quiet hallway. "The developer in Eugene said the offer on the coastal lot expires on Friday. Once the bank locks the accounts permanently, we won't even have the deposit money to secure the construction equipment for the new site." "She sign it," Chelsea hissed, her manicured fingers tapping against the clipboard. "She's a mess, Bradley. She's a grieving, exhausted housewife who hasn't slept in 36 hours. Just play the grieving son for 5 more minutes, get her to sign the general power of attorney, and we can handle the rest. She won't even realize the coastal lot is gone until the tax assessment comes next year." A grieving, exhausted housewife. I almost laughed. They truly didn't know me. They saw the faded jeans, the old Subaru, the worn canvas bag. And they thought they were dealing with a woman who could be icily pushed aside. They forgot that I was the one who balanced the books. I was the one who negotiated the interest rates. I was the one who built the foundation they were currently trying to stand on. I stepped through the double doors, letting the heavy glass swing shut behind me with a loud, deliberate click. They both jumped, instantly separating. Chelsea hid the clipboard behind her back, her face twisting into a tight, plastic smile. "Mom," Bradley said, taking a step toward me, his hands outstretched. "You're back. You look exhausted. Did you find the insurance card?" "I found everything I was looking for, Bradley," I said, my voice quiet, calm, and entirely devoid of the trembling act I had put on over the phone. I walked past them and sat down in one of the blue vinyl chairs. I slowly unzipped my wet yellow raincoat, letting it drape over the back of the chair. I placed my canvas bag on my lap, my hands resting on top of it. Chelsea exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Bradley. She stepped forward, pulling the clipboard out from behind her back. Mom, while you were gone, the hospital administration coordinator came by. They said they need some paperwork signed immediately to guarantee Arthur's ICU bed. You know how these private insurance companies are. If we don't have a designated power of attorney on file, they might transfer him to a state facility. It was a lie, of course. A clumsy, desperate lie. A hospital cannot transfer an ICU patient on a ventilator to a state facility because of a missing power of attorney. But they thought I didn't know that. They thought the fear of losing Arthur would make me sign anything they put in front of me. Is that so, Chelsea? I asked, looking up at her. I looked at her expensive, cream-colored designer bag, sitting on the floor. I looked at her perfect, polished nails. Let me see the paperwork. Bradley quickly stepped forward, pulling a pen from his pocket. Here, Mom, it's just a standard authorization form. It gives me the authority to handle the billing and the property assets so you don't have to worry about a thing. Just sign right here on the bottom line, and Chelsea and I will take care of the rest. He handed me the clipboard. I took it. I looked at the document. It wasn't a hospital authorization form. It was a general power of attorney, drafted from a cheap online template, giving Bradley full, unrestricted access to all of our personal and commercial assets, including the right to sell real estate. Attached to the back of it was a quitclaim deed for the 3-acre coastal lot overlooking the Batha land Arthur and I had bought 30 years ago with our first $5,000 of savings, the land where we planned to build our retirement cottage. The deed had already been filled out. The grantor was listed as *, the Arthur and Darlene Vance Revocable Living Trust *. The grantee was listed as * BC Development LLC *, and there, at the bottom of the deed, was a forged signature. Arthur's signature. It was a shaky, pathetic imitation of my husband's strong, steady handwriting. They had obviously held a pen in his paralyzed hand, or perhaps they had simply traced an old check. It was a forgery so obvious that any junior title clerk would have flagged it in 5 seconds. I looked at the signature, and for a moment, the sheer agonizing pain of the betrayal threatened to choke me. They had gone into Arthur's room. They had stood over his unconscious body, a man who had loved them, who had built a life for them, and they had forced a pen into his hand to steal his land. I looked up at my son. Bradley, I said, my voice, barely a whisper, but it carried a cold, heavy silence that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Did your father sign this? Yes, Mom, Bradley said, without blinking, his eyes wide with a terrifying, sociopathic sincerity. He signed it yesterday morning, before he had the stroke. He wanted to make sure Chelsea and I were taken care of. You know how he is. He was always worried about our future. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Your father had his stroke at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Bradley, I said, my voice dropping into a register that made him take a half step back. The doctor certified the timeline. And at 10:15 last night, while your father was lying paralyzed on the concrete floor of his workshop, you were sitting at his desk, trying to transfer $85,000 out of his operating account. Bradley's face went entirely white. The color drained from his lips, leaving them a dry, dusty gray. Mom, what are you talking about? He stammered, his hand reaching out to grip the back of Chelsea's chair. That's not true. I was at home last night. I didn't. I called Sarah at the credit union. Bradley, I continued, my voice steady, measured, and completely unyielding. I've spent 30 years tracing paper trails. Did you really think you could hide a digital footprint from an escrow officer? Did you really think I wouldn't see the 3 failed login attempts from your mobile phone while your father was fighting for his life? Chelsea's plastic smile shattered. Darlene, you're confused. You're under a lot of stress. Bradley was just trying to help. Shut up, Chelsea, I said, not even looking at her. My eyes were locked on my son. Mom, please, Bradley whispered, his voice cracking as the reality of what he had done began to dawn on him. It's not what you think. We were in trouble. The development in Eugene, we put a deposit down, and if we don't clear the funds, we'll lose everything. We were just going to borrow the money from the boatyard account. We were going to pay it back, I swear. With a forged deed? I asked, holding up the clipboard. With a power of attorney you tried to trick your own mother into signing in the waiting room of an intensive care unit. I stood up. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the clipboard. I simply stood up, and in that moment, in my wet yellow raincoat and my squeaking boots, I felt a quiet, devastating strength flow through my veins. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the secure envelope Sarah had given me. I slid the notarized revocation of power of attorney out of the envelope and placed it on top of the clipboard, right over his fraudulent deed. As of 12 o'clock today, Bradley, your signing authority on all corporate and personal accounts has been legally revoked, I said, my words falling like heavy iron anchors. The accounts are frozen. The credit cards in your name have been deactivated. The wire transfer to BC Development has been cancelled and flagged for fraudulent activity. Bradley gasped, his hands flying to his pockets, pulling out his phone. His fingers scrambled over the screen, his eyes widening in pure horror as he saw the notifications from the bank. No, Mom, you can't do this, he cried, his voice rising in a high, panicked pitch that drew the attention of a nurse walking down the hall. The payroll for the boatyard is due on Friday. The suppliers, they'll pull our credit. You're going to ruin the business. The business is mine, Bradley, I said, stepping closer to him, until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Your father and I built it. You were just a guest, and today, your reservation has been cancelled. Chelsea stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a venomous, desperate rage. You old bitch. You can't just cut us off. We have bills to pay, we have a life. Then I suggest you get a job, Chelsea, I said, my voice as cold and flat as the Oregon coast in January. I turned away from them, walking toward the heavy wooden door of Arthur's room. I paused, my hand on the brass handle, and looked back at my son one last time. The police have already been notified of the unauthorized online transfers, I said quietly, and the doctor has documented the delay in your 911 call. If I were you, Bradley, I would use whatever cash you have left in your pockets to find a very good lawyer. I pushed the door open, stepping into the quiet, rhythmic warmth of Arthur's room, leaving them standing in the hallway as the cold realization of their complete ruin finally settled over them. The heavy wooden door of room 312 clicked shut behind me, instantly swallowing the sharp, desperate echoes of Bradley's panic in the hallway. In here, the world was reduced to a slow, clinical rhythm. The steady mechanical asterisk, whoosh-click, whoosh-click asterisk of the ventilator. The soft green pulse of the heart monitor on the wall. The faint smell of antiseptic and damp rain clinging to my wool sweater. I walked over to the side of the bed and sat down in the rigid vinyl chair, my knees aching from the damp coastal cold. I reached out and took Arthur's hand in mine. His skin was pale, cooler than it should have been, but it was still his hand, the hand that had held mine for 34 years. The palm was rough, calloused from decades of handling cedar and oak, with a faint, permanent tracing of dark grease under the fingernails from the boatyard engines. I squeezed it gently, pressing my thumb against his wrist, feeling the slow, stubborn thready beat of his pulse. I'm here, Artie, I whispered, using the nickname I hadn't used since we were newlyweds, living in a drafty trailer down by the docks. I'm here. And they're not going to hurt you anymore. I've taken the wheel. Over the next 3 weeks, that hospital room became my entire world. I slept on the narrow vinyl cot the nurses brought in for me, my canvas tote bag tucked securely under my pillow. I didn't go back to our house, not even to clean up the mess Bradley had made in my office. I didn't want to see it. Instead, I ran my husband's life and my own defense from a small wooden clipboard balanced on my knees. When you spend 30 years in escrow, you learn that the law doesn't care about your tears, but it cares deeply about a timeline. I spent those long, quiet nights compiling my evidence. I printed the digital logs Sarah had pulled from the credit union, showing the exact IP address of the mobile device that had tried to hack Arthur's master account while he lay on the workshop floor. I secured a certified copy of the medical report from Dr. Sterling, which explicitly stated that Arthur's stroke had occurred hours before the 911 call was placed. And finally, I filed a formal asterisk lis pendens, asterisk a notice of pending litigation against the title of our coastal lot at the Coos County Recorder's Office. That last step was the nail in the coffin for Bradley's plans. A clouded title is a developer's worst nightmare. The moment the Eugene firm saw that there was a legal dispute over the ownership of the land, and that the previous deed carried a suspected forged signature, they pulled their offer. They didn't just walk away, they ran. Without that land sale, and with all of our joint accounts frozen tight under the emergency elder abuse protocol, Bradley's fragile financial house of cards collapsed. The supplier for his development company placed a lien on his truck. The lease on his and Chelsea's expensive apartment in Eugene went into default. Within a month, the luxury lifestyle they had built on a foundation of grease and promises began to splinter into 1,000 pieces. Let me stop here for a moment. I know some of you are listening to this, perhaps sitting at your own kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, wondering how a mother could do this to her own child. You might think I was cold. You might think I was vindictive. But let me ask you this. If you saw a wolf at your husband's throat, would you stop to ask if the wolf was hungry before you pulled the trigger? No. You protect the person who spent his life protecting you. My strength didn't come from a place of malice. It came from the quiet, devastating realization that if I didn't stand between my son and my husband, Arthur would die in this bed with nothing left to his name but a forged signature. The police investigation was quiet but thorough. Detective Miller, a soft-spoken man who had known Arthur for years, came to the hospital to take my statement. He looked at the paperwork I had compiled, the logs, the medical timeline, the forged quitclaim deed. He didn't say much. He just nodded, his face grim, and tucked the folder into his briefcase. Bradley was never arrested in a dramatic public scene. Instead, he was served with a formal summons for elder financial exploitation and grand larceny. When the reality of what he was facing finally hit him, the bravado disappeared. The expensive designer clothes and the arrogant posture vanished, replaced by the desperate, hollow-eyed panic of a boy who had finally realized his mother wasn't going to save him from the storm he had created. He called me one night in late November. The hospital room was dark, save for the green glow of Arthur's monitors. I let the phone ring 4 times before I answered it. Mom. His voice was small, shaking, stripped of all the smooth, practiced charm he had used in the waiting room. Mom, please. They're talking about prison time. The lawyer says if you don't drop the civil suit and withdraw the bank complaint, the DA is going to push for a full indictment. Chelsea is leaving me, Mom. She took her things and went to her sister's in Portland. I have nothing left. Please, you have to help me. I sat there in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of my husband. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, hot and stinging. It was the first time I had cried since I drove back into Coos Bay in the pouring rain. The pain of hearing your child broken on the other end of the line is a physical ache, a weight that settles right behind your breastbone and stays there forever. I wanted to tell him it was going to be okay. I wanted to tell him to come home, that I would pay the lawyers, that we would fix it. But then I looked at Arthur. I looked at the plastic tube in his throat. I remembered the 12 hours he had spent alone on that cold concrete floor while his son hovered over him like a vulture, waiting for him to slip far enough away that he couldn't fight back. No, Bradley, I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper, but as unyielding as the coastal cliffs. I'm not going to save you. You chose this ledger. Now you have to balance it. Mom, please. He sobbed. I'm your son. How can you be so cold? I love you, Bradley, I said, and for the first time in weeks, my voice trembled with the sheer, crushing weight of my grief. I will always love you. But love is a gift, not a line item in a budget. You don't get to spend it when you've declared bankruptcy on your own humanity. You need to face what you did. For your own soul's sake, you need to face it. I hung up the phone before he could reply, and I turned it off. We didn't go to trial. In the end, Bradley accepted a plea agreement. He received 5 years of probation, a mandatory restitution order that stripped him of whatever minor assets he had left, and a permanent criminal record for felony financial abuse. He had to sign a formal, legally binding disclaimer of any future interest in the Vance family trust. He was cut off, completely and permanently, from the estate he had tried to steal. It was a quiet conclusion, devoid of any grand courtroom drama, but it was absolute. It has been a year since that Tuesday in the rain. The Oregon spring has finally arrived, turning the gray hills of Coos Bay into a vibrant, deep green. The storm has passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet peace. Arthur is home now. He isn't back to the way he was. The stroke left him with a permanent weakness on his right side and a slow, deliberate hesitation in his speech. He can no longer hold the heavy adze to shape the cedar timbers for his boats, and his hands are no longer stained with teak oil. But yesterday, we walked down to the coastal lot together. The 3 acres of land overlooking the bay were quiet, the wild rhododendrons blooming in soft pinks and whites against the dark pines. The wind was blowing off the Pacific, carrying the clean, salty scent of the tide. Arthur stood beside me, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, one he had carved himself with his left hand during his physical therapy sessions. We stood on the grassy bluff, looking out at the water where the fishing boats were heading out past the jetty. I reached down and took his hand, sliding my fingers into his rough, quiet palm. He turned his head slowly, looking at me with those steady, familiar blue eyes, and gave my hand a firm, deliberate squeeze. Beautiful, Darlene, he murmured, his voice thick but clear. Our land. Yes, Artie, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of his chest. Our land, and nobody is ever going to take it away from us. We stood there for a long time, watching the sun slowly dip below the horizon, painting the gray Oregon sky in shades of deep, quiet gold.